The pink monster. When I was growing up, I was tormented by something outside my bedroom window. I was very young, not even in kindergarten yet, and I was terrified to sleep in my own bedroom. In my room, there was a large window that looked out into the backyard. On my bed, I could look out and see the whole thing. Anyways, every time I lay down to sleep, I would see something in the backyard that terrified me. I called it the pink monster. I can only describe it as a very large pink art mannequin with a featureless blank face. This monster would walk around my backyard and stare into my bedroom window. It would even come up to my window and pound on it, staring in. It terrified my parents, and they had no clue what was wrong. They never saw it themselves because whenever they would go outside to investigate, it would disappear. This happened periodically for a few years. When I was 5 years old, my brother was born, and my bedroom was moved down the hall into the spare bedroom, where I had no view of the backyard. When my brother got a little older, he began being terrorized by something in the backyard too. When my mom asked him what was wrong, he could only say that there was a pink monster outside his window. The monster haunted him periodically like it did me, but after a few years they stopped and we haven't seen it since. It still gives my family chills. There's no way he could have heard about the pink monster from anyone else because we didn't talk about it. Any thoughts? My boyfriend saw something inhumanely tall and pale. So if I've never had a paranormal experience in my life, my boyfriend seems to have enough for the both of us. One of the ones that stuck with me was when we went camping last year at Ovens National Park. We had just arrived back from spending the summer in Western Canada and hadn't seen each other in 4 months. So we decided to spend some time together and go camping with another couple that were close friends of ours. We booked the cheapest cabin at the campground for 2 nights and headed out. The first day we spent there was pretty uneventful. To give some context, the park is famous for its sea caves that are carved into rocky cliffs of the Nova Scotian shore. The first day we hiked the trail that overlooked the caves, or the ovens as they were called, and we were able to go down into some of them. That night, we had a campfire, but turned in early because we're nerds. So we sat inside the small cabin and started playing cards. My boyfriend was being a sore loser and seemed to be acting kinda strange nonetheless. He abruptly said he was going for a walk and left the cabin. I was pretty annoyed and just let him go for a while and didn't chase him. After about half an hour, I started to get a bit anxious and called his cell. This is where things started to get weird. He didn't answer at first, but he called me back right away. When I answered, he seemed to have calmed down a bit. I asked him where he was. He said he was sitting on a bench on the trail. Then he asked where I was. This confused me a bit because I hadn't left the cabin since he left, and I wasn't likely to since I'm terrified of the dark. I told him this, and this suddenly freaked him out, and he said he was coming back to the cabin. It was weird because he's generally pretty level-headed and hard to actually scare. So after about 2 minutes, I hear running footsteps coming to the cabin, and my boyfriend comes tearing into the cabin. Then, this is what he told me. He had walked out to the trails to get some fresh air and sat down on one of the benches to look out at the ocean. The moon was pretty bright, so everything was illuminated pretty well. Then he said he heard someone walking by and he saw this really tall and pale figure stop and look at him and then continue on. For some reason, he assumed this was me coming to look for him, and that's when I called him and told him I was in the cabin. He said that in retrospect, it was inhumanely tall and pale and couldn't possibly be a person. He was not himself for the rest of the night and didn't seem normal until lunch the next day. Again, sorry for the long story, I made an account just to make this post. Does anyone have any ideas about what this might have been? Don't say Slender Man. I'm imagining something like the Fresno Nightcrawlers. Birmingham Park Monster. Just realized I have something to write about in here. I'm a pretty skeptical guy, and this is pretty much the only weird thing I've seen in my life that I can't explain in the slightest. So, cut back to December-ish 2006. I'm 16 at the time, and I live in Birmingham, UK. Me and my two friends of the same age had been Christmas shopping in the city center and came back on the train. Getting home, our choices are, number 1, walk around the giant park in the freezing cold, which would take about 20 minutes, or number 2, cut through the park in the pitch black, and it takes about 5 minutes. We went with choice 2. This park had a bit of a reputation for being quite rough, but it's quite late, so there's nobody around anyway. As we're about halfway through the park, we see something weird. At first we thought it was a guy on a bike, because it was moving pretty slowly. We also thought he was quite close to us, because he looked so big. Then he passed behind a basketball cage, and we realized it was much further away than we thought. As it got closer, we saw that it wasn't on a bike. So I put the height on this thing at about 7 feet, wearing all white. It didn't look dissimilar to a Klansman, and it's sort of gliding. Imagine how someone would move across the horizontal plane if they were on a bike, and now take the bike away. Its arms were disproportionately long and held out in front of it, part of the reason we thought it was someone on a bike. Despite it being really late, us being the only people in the park and audibly saying, "What the fuck is that?" it didn't pay us any attention at all. It just carried on going across the middle of the park, not towards any exits though. We made the choice to just run the rest of the way. I jokingly said to one of my friends that it must have been a monster, but after some discussion, we didn't have a clue what it was. My one friend was just adamant that it wasn't a monster, but couldn't say what it was. From that point on, it was the Poolway Park Monster. We were drinking, illegally in a local pub, and my believer friend and I jokingly suggested we should go and look for it. It had been a week or so since we saw it. We weren't scared, and if anything, it had become a bit of a joke. So we walked up to the park and got about 100 yards in when we saw it. Tall and white, just stood there in the middle of the park. We quickly stopped laughing and sort of froze. Whatever it was crouched down. We thought our eyes were playing tricks, so we went a bit further in. It stood up, moved forward, and crouched down again. We dipped straight away and didn't look back. So, at this point, we told all our friends about it, and they kept wanting to go and look for it, but we wouldn't go after the second time. 2 of us had seen it twice, and another of us had seen it once. Over the next couple of years, I caught up with some of my friends that I hadn't seen in a while. They lived locally, but for whatever reason, different schools, etc., we hadn't spoken much. In a pub with one of them, the guy was my best friend but barely attended college, so I hardly saw him over a 2-year period. We remain best friends now, and I trust him absolutely. We were discussing weird shit like UFOs, etc., and he tells me he's got a story for me. I hadn't told him my story yet. Recently, at the time about 2007 to 2008, he was in Marston Green Park, about 10 minutes drive from the Poolway Park, with his dad, and they were walking towards the exit. They saw something white, moving fast across the park. Eerily, they said they didn't realize how far away it was, until it passed behind something in the distance. In this case, a set of full-size soccer posts. They thought it was much closer and now realized how tall it was. Again, I caught up with another friend who hung out around with a different group. The story came up and he looked shocked and excitedly told me something that happened to him and his friends a few years prior, 2005 to 2006, in Sutton Park. one of Europe's largest urban parks. It's huge, basically a nature reserve with loads of forest in, and you could easily get lost in there if you're not careful. Him and a group of friends had gone up there just to piss around, but they left after realizing they were being followed at a distance by something that was in all white, and kept crouching down behind things when they looked up at it. That's all for now. But as I said, even if other people hadn't seen it or something similar, it's still pretty much the only thing I don't have a realistic explanation for. I found it particularly weird that it's only ever seen in parks.